I have observed enough financial strategies to recognize when capital expenditure transcends economics and becomes an act of geopolitical liberation. Most government spending, even at enormous scale, represents allocation of resources within existing structures. It maintains systems rather than transforming them. It adjusts relationships rather than ending them. But occasionally, very rarely, you witness capital deployment that is explicitly designed to break dependencies that have persisted for generations, to create alternatives where none existed, to transform subordination into sovereignty through systematic construction of infrastructure that makes independence operationally feasible rather than merely rhetorically desirable. What Mark Carney announced in Canada's 2025 federal budget was precisely this kind of transformative capital deployment. $1.2 trillion over 5 years, dedicated explicitly to breaking the 80-year American grip on Canadian economic policy, not reducing American influence, not negotiating better terms within American-dominated systems, breaking the grip entirely through construction of comprehensive alternatives that would allow Canada to function prosperously without American approval. I want to emphasize the historical magnitude of what Carney committed Canada to achieving. Since the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which established American dominance over the post-war international economic order, every Canadian government had operated within a framework where fundamental strategic choices required American consent. Trade policy needed to accommodate American preferences. Resource development needed to serve American industrial requirements. Financial regulation needed to maintain compatibility with American systems. Foreign policy needed to avoid antagonizing American interests. This was not explicitly stated in treaties or formal agreements. It was simply understood. Canada was integrated into American economic structures so comprehensively that independence was operationally impossible. American strategists had designed the system deliberately. The goal was not to exploit Canada economically, though exploitation certainly occurred. The goal was to ensure that Canada could never become an alternative model that demonstrated American dominance was optional rather than inevitable. An independent, prosperous Canada, sharing a border with the United States while maintaining its own strategic orientation, would prove that proximity to American power did not require submission to American power. That example would encourage other nations to pursue independence. Therefore, Canadian independence had to be prevented through systematic elimination of alternatives. For 80 years, this strategy functioned perfectly. Canadian governments that attempted even modest assertions of independence discovered they had no alternatives to fall back on. Markets were American-dominated. Supply chains ran through American infrastructure. Financial systems required American clearing mechanisms. Any serious attempt to chart an independent course would trigger capital flight, supply disruptions, and market access problems that would devastate the Canadian economy within months. So Canadian governments learned not to attempt serious independence. They accepted subordination disguised as partnership and told themselves this was pragmatic realism rather than structural coercion. Mark Carney understood this history with unusual clarity. As governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, he had watched American financial mismanagement trigger a global economic catastrophe while Canadian institutions remained stable. As governor of the Bank of England, he had observed how American weaponization of the dollar system forced even major economies to structure their policies around American preferences. He recognized that Canadian subordination was not inevitable or natural. It was the product of deliberate American strategy, combined with Canadian failure to build alternatives. When Trump's tariffs classified Canadian steel and aluminum as threats to American national security, Carney recognized this was not a temporary trade dispute. This was confirmation that the American government viewed Canadian economic activity through a lens of control and coercion rather than partnership. Continued dependence on American markets and American infrastructure meant continued vulnerability to arbitrary American policy shifts. True sovereignty required alternatives, and alternatives required capital, strategy, and time. The $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program announced in Budget 2025 was structured around 3 integrated pillars, each designed to address a specific dimension of Canadian dependence on American systems. The first pillar allocated $340 billion to construction of east-west trade corridors that would allow Canadian goods to reach global markets without transiting American territory or using American infrastructure. For 8 decades, Canadian trade had been structured around north-south flows. Resources moved south to American processors. Finished goods moved north to Canadian consumers. This pattern was not economically optimal. It was structurally coercive. Canadian exporters had no practical alternative to American markets because the infrastructure to reach other markets did not exist. Rail lines ran north-south. Ports were optimized for American destinations. Regulatory systems were integrated with American frameworks. Changing this pattern required systematic construction of alternatives that would make east-west trade as feasible as north-south trade had been. $340 billion funded expansion of Pacific port capacity in Vancouver and Prince Rupert to handle dramatically increased Asian trade. Atlantic port development in Halifax created European trade infrastructure that did not require St. Lawrence seaway access, which passes through American waters. Rail line upgrades from coast to coast eliminated bottlenecks that had made long-distance Canadian shipping uneconomical. Border infrastructure with Alaska was enhanced to facilitate Arctic trade routes. Most significantly, digital infrastructure and regulatory harmonization with European and Asian systems meant Canadian exporters could access those markets with the same ease they had previously accessed American markets. The psychological impact of this infrastructure investment extended beyond its direct economic effects. For the first time, Canadian businesses could credibly threaten to abandon American markets if terms became unacceptable. That threat, which had been empty rhetoric for 80 years, suddenly became operationally feasible. American buyers who had treated Canadian suppliers as captive dependencies discovered those suppliers now had Asian and European alternatives. The balance of negotiating power shifted fundamentally. The second pillar allocated $280 billion to critical minerals processing and advanced manufacturing. Canada possesses extraordinary mineral wealth: uranium, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, potash. For 8 decades, Canadian strategy had been to export these materials in raw form to American processors, then import finished products at premium prices. This pattern guaranteed American value capture from Canadian resources while ensuring Canadian economic dependence on American industrial capacity. $280 billion funded construction of domestic processing facilities that would allow Canada to capture the full value chain from extraction through finished products. Lithium processing plants in Ontario meant Canadian lithium would power Canadian battery production, rather than enriching American manufacturers. Rare earth element refineries in Quebec eliminated dependence on American processors for materials essential to advanced technology. Uranium enrichment facilities ensured Canadian nuclear fuel could serve both domestic reactors and international customers without American intermediation. The strategic logic was straightforward. Raw material exports made Canada a resource colony. Value-added production made Canada an industrial power. American dominance had depended on keeping Canada locked into colonial resource relationships. Breaking that dominance required systematic construction of industrial capacity that American policy had spent 80 years preventing Canada from developing. But the third pillar represented Carney's most audacious strategic innovation: $180 billion committed to the Arctic Gateway Initiative centered on Churchill Port in Manitoba. For decades, Churchill had been dismissed as economically irrelevant, a remote northern port with seasonal ice conditions that made commercial shipping impractical. But Carney recognized that climate change was progressively opening Arctic shipping routes, and Churchill was the only deepwater Arctic port in North America, with direct rail connection to continental markets. The geometry of Arctic shipping transforms global trade patterns. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers using Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence Seaway or American ports. 12 days of reduced transit time, $620,000 in fuel cost savings per voyage. For bulk commodities like grain, minerals, and manufactured goods, these savings make the difference between profitable and unprofitable trade relationships. $180 billion funded transformation of a Churchill from seasonal outpost to year-round deepwater port capable of handling the largest container ships and bulk carriers. Icebreaker capacity was expanded to ensure 12-month navigation. Rail infrastructure from Winnipeg to Churchill was completely rebuilt with permafrost protection systems, automated switching, and capacity to handle dramatically increased traffic. Port facilities included grain terminals, container handling systems, and bulk loading infrastructure rivaling anything on the continent. But the real significance of Churchill extended far beyond its direct economic value. Churchill represented Canada's geographic liberation from American control. For 80 years, Canadian trade with Europe and Asia had required either transit through American waters or passage through the Panama Canal, which American power could theoretically close to Canadian shipping. Arctic routes through Canadian territorial waters eliminated this vulnerability entirely. Canadian goods could reach global markets using infrastructure entirely under Canadian control, immune to American interdiction or political pressure. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat bound for Germany. European grain buyers immediately recognized they could source Canadian agricultural products without American intermediation or American political risk. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as buyers competed for supply agreements that guaranteed Arctic route delivery. Potash prices spiked 31% as fertilizer companies scrambled for Canadian sourcing that bypassed American territory. The market was pricing in a fundamental transformation. For the first time since 1944, a major North American resource economy could reach global markets without American permission. The implications extended far beyond agricultural commodities. Any Canadian export that could move by container or bulk carrier could now bypass American infrastructure entirely. The monopoly that had given the United States veto power over Canadian trade for 8 decades had been broken. But Carney understood that infrastructure alone was insufficient. Independence required not just physical capacity, but also diplomatic relationships that would provide market access and political support. While Trump was systematically alienating traditional American allies through unpredictable policy and rhetorical hostility, Carney was constructing a coalition of nations eager for alternatives to American dominance. The comprehensive trade agreement with the European Union, worth $244 billion, integrated Canadian companies into European defense supply chains and established preferential access for Canadian resources and manufactured goods. This was not simply commerce, this was Europe, signaling that if American commitment to transatlantic partnership continued eroding, Canada represented a reliable alternative for critical resources and strategic cooperation. Bilateral agreements with ASEAN nations specifically targeted the 700 million person Asian market. Canadian agricultural products, minerals, and manufactured goods gained preferential access to markets that were growing faster than American markets and offered better terms. Most significantly, these agreements included provisions for trade settlement in currencies other than the US dollar, reducing Canadian dependence on American financial infrastructure. Even the relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision. Without endorsing China's political system or compromising on fundamental values, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power, willing to maintain economic relationships with all major powers while serving as strategic proxy for none. This neutrality, impossible under the previous model of Canadian-American integration, became valuable precisely because it allowed Chinese companies access to North American resources without the political complications of dealing with an increasingly hostile United States. The cumulative effect of these diplomatic initiatives combined with infrastructure investment was a complete reorientation of Canadian economic relationships. By late 2025, Canadian exports to Europe had increased 34% year over year. Exports to Asia had risen 28%. Meanwhile, Canadian exports to the United States were declining not because of reduced Canadian production, but because Canadian producers were finding better terms in alternative markets. American agricultural buyers who had treated Canadian suppliers as captive dependencies discovered those suppliers now had European and Asian customers willing to pay premium prices. American manufacturers who had relied on Canadian materials faced supply constraints as Canadian producers prioritized non-American customers. The assumption that Canadian economic activity would naturally orient toward American markets because no alternatives existed had been systematically invalidated. I want to emphasize what $1.2 trillion in strategic capital deployment actually purchased. Not just infrastructure and diplomatic agreements, though those were significant. What Carney's program purchased was operational independence, the physical and diplomatic capability to function prosperously without American approval. Canadian businesses now possessed alternative markets. Canadian exporters now controlled alternative transportation infrastructure. Canadian trade now utilized alternative financial systems. The monopoly that had given the United States control over Canadian economic policy for 8 decades no longer existed. This transformation occurred with remarkable speed because Carney had used the Trump tariffs to create political consensus for what would otherwise have been impossibly expensive. $1.2 trillion represents approximately 1/3 of Canadian GDP. Under normal circumstances, no government could justify such massive expenditure for strategic reorientation. But Trump's classification of Canadian steel and aluminum as national security threats provided perfect justification. Carney could tell Canadians that sovereignty required investment, and they accepted it because continued dependence now felt more risky than the cost of independence. The timing was equally strategic. By launching the program immediately after the tariff announcement, Carney ensured maximum political support, while American attention was focused on domestic political battles. By targeting completion of key infrastructure before the July 2026 USMCA review, Carney guaranteed Canada would approach those negotiations from a position of genuine independence rather than desperate dependence. American negotiators arriving at the USMCA review faced a completely transformed situation. The assumption that Canada needed American market access more than the United States needed Canadian resources had been systematically invalidated. Carney could credibly state that Canada preferred continued partnership, but no longer required it for prosperity. Canadian businesses had alternative customers, Canadian exporters had alternative infrastructure, Canadian trade had alternative financial mechanisms. The leverage that American negotiators had taken for granted for 8 decades no longer existed. The consequences of this leverage shift became visible immediately. American corporate leaders testifying before Congress begged the administration not to destroy relationships their survival depended on. Ford cited $1.4 billion in losses from Canadian supply disruptions. GM closed Michigan plants due to Canadian component costs. The American Trucking Association called the tariff policy economically suicidal. When your own corporate sector publicly contradicts your trade strategy, you have lost control of the negotiation. But the deeper transformation was psychological rather than economic. Canadian citizens who had participated in the 68% boycott of American goods discovered that avoiding American products did not reduce their quality of life. European and Asian alternatives were available and often superior. Canadian businesses that had developed European and Asian customer relationships discovered those customers paid fairly and honored contracts reliably. Canadian policymakers who had built trade relationships outside American systems discovered that international legitimacy did not require American approval. Once populations and institutions internalize these lessons, they persist regardless of political leadership changes. The Canadian executive, who spent 2 years developing Vietnamese supply relationships, will not abandon them because a new American administration offers concessions. The logistics infrastructure built to ship through Churchill will not be dismantled because Washington returns to previous trade terms. The diplomatic relationships forged with Europe and Asia will not be discarded because American policy becomes more accommodating. This permanence is what makes Carney's strategy historically significant. He did not negotiate better terms within American-dominated systems. He constructed comprehensive alternatives that allow Canada to function entirely outside those systems if Canadian interests require it. The relationship with the United States continues because both nations benefit from trade and cooperation. But the relationship now occurs between sovereign equals rather than between hegemon and subordinate. I have observed enough imperial transitions to recognize when structural power permanently shifts. The infrastructure exists. The diplomatic relationships exist. The alternative markets exist. Most importantly, the psychological orientation exists. Canadians have internalized that they possess choices about their economic relationships. That internalization cannot be reversed through American policy adjustment or diplomatic pressure. What Mark Carney deployed was not merely $1.2 trillion. What he deployed was a comprehensive strategy for transforming structural dependence into operational independence. Every dollar was allocated to creating alternatives where American policy had ensured none existed. Every project was designed to eliminate leverage that American dominance had depended on. Every diplomatic initiative was structured to provide options that made American approval unnecessary. The 80-year American grip on Canadian policy did not end through confrontation or conflict. It ended through systematic construction of alternatives, funded by strategic capital deployment at unprecedented scale. By the time American strategists understood what was occurring, the transformation was already irreversible. The infrastructure was operational, the relationships were established, the alternatives were functioning. History does not record intentions or strategies. History records outcomes. And the outcome of Mark Carney's $1.2 trillion sovereignty program is the end of Canadian subordination to American power, not through hostility or isolation, but through the quiet confidence that comes from possessing genuine alternatives. The grip has been broken. What comes next will be determined by how well both nations adapt to a relationship between equals rather than between hegemon and subordinate. But the structure has permanently changed. The monopoly has been eliminated, the alternatives exist, and once alternatives exist, dominance becomes negotiation. That transformation from dominance to negotiation is what $1.2 trillion purchased. It was the best investment Canada ever made.